Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about JavaScript and the var and let keyword. So let's get into it. So I saw a question today regarding basically, well, the core of the question was this: why did we introduce the let keyword to declare a variable instead of just modifying the var keyword? So why can you say both var and let, and they pretty much, at least from your perspective, unless we're going to go into the technical details as to why one does the one thing and one does the other thing, why didn't we just modify var? Now this is a fair question. It's a good question, and it touches on something that I think is very, very important. That is, I think, so important that every single programmer needs to be aware of this. And it's something that you don't, as a beginner, you don't think about this at all. I can promise you that you don't. This is the core, this is the root problem that you have with all of these libraries, people who put libraries into a code base, who create like these unnecessary dependencies, who create all of this spider web of problems based on not actually understanding this very fundamental, simple little thing. And that simple little fundamental thing that the good people at TC39 and like all the people who are involved in JavaScript know and know very well is that you need to be backwards compatible when you create a platform that people build their stuff on top of. Now, what does it mean to be backwards compatible? Well, it's very simple. So if you create something, it can be anything. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you create a programming language such as JavaScript. Now, it gets really popular, and you have all these symbols and all of these different like ways that you can express yourself in the language, right? And then people start using it for their own purposes. They start building their own applications with your programming language, and everybody's happy, right? And then you realize further down the line that shit, like you're starting to get in issues and bug reports and feature requests and stuff of this nature. And then you realize that, wow, one thing that wasn't so great is the implementation of how a certain thing works, like a loop, or in this case, a variable declaration. It doesn't really work so well. There are a few technical limitations that we would like to fix here. Now, the question is, can you actually change the existing keyword, the existing thing? Well, if you think about it, what would happen if you changed the behavior of a variable declaration, or the way a loop works? Let's just take a really stupid and simple example. What if you decided that you don't want your loop to loop forwards? You want it to, like, by default loop backwards. Could you do that? Well, if we think about that, that would literally mean that you change under the hood the semantics of how a loop works within your programming language. In other words, every single program that was ever written using your programming language that was assuming that the loop was going forward is now going to go backwards, which means that every single program could technically break. That's the problem. You can't, when you have people depending on things working in a certain way, you can't just change it, because all of a sudden you will break everything for everybody who has depended on your programming language. And this is not just true for JavaScript or for programming languages in general. This is true for pretty much everything. If you're using like microservices or like a service-oriented architecture, or if you're producing some type of API of some sort, if you want to change something, you need to think about what the impact of changing that thing is going to mean for somebody who is depending on the thing that you are building. And this is a big problem. Trust me when I say this. This is like one of the biggest and most major reasons as to why things break in general in software development. If you have, like, it's not even just that, it's the main reason as to why it becomes very tricky for you to maneuver in a code base. It's very simple. If you tell me, like, I have an analogy where I say that every technical decision that you make, every library you add, every part of your workflow you modify in some fashion to do something very specific, it's like adding a thread to a ball or like to your project. And in the beginning, just having 1 or 2 threads, like these different libraries and technical decisions that you've made, still makes it fairly easy if you want to move things around, because all you have to do is to make sure that if you're moving something a little bit, that you check these threads, that make sure that these threads are still intact. Because that's the thing about being backwards compatible and making sure that you don't have regressions or anything like that. You need to be able to actually, in this scenario, you actually do have to be able to see the whole system, because you need to be sure that the changes that you introduce don't break all already existing decisions, and each thread is a decision. Now imagine that you have hundreds of these threads, which is actually, well, not that uncommon that you have quite a lot of these decisions. Let's not say hundreds, but quite a lot of them. The more threads you have, the more things that are connected, the harder it is for you to move something. Because if you move one thing, you may have 5 threads that break, and then you need to figure out, how can I move my project and take new directions and new decisions and still maintain the way that this is working? And that's where this cascade of legacy kind of just continues, because you can't just make whatever decision you want without making sure that you're backwards compatible, so that you don't break already existing features, because otherwise you might as well just have to rewrite things. This is usually the way that people who throw out the rewrite argument very quickly, they kind of have this sensation. I've seen it 100 times where they try to change something in the story. I can see the frustration building up in them, and finally they just kind of go, this is such a hassle to just make anything happen. Why don't we just rewrite this? And I just sit there and I just shake my head and like just remember that this is the same goddamn person who added library A, B, and C. Why? Yeah. If you want to check out a language who is like one of the master languages when it comes to trying to fix being backwards compatible, have a look at PHP. PHP is probably, at least there are probably some other languages as well, but in my world, PHP has, like, you can look at all the methods and the interface. They have really struggled, like PHP has struggled with this, like keeping something nice and clean at the same time being backwards compatible. So what I want you to take away from this is basically that when it comes to JavaScript specifically, changing var to let is like a complete no-go, because the way that var works today, there's tons and tons and tons of systems that depend on the var keyword to work the way it does today. And let introduces a new way of working that we basically needed a new way of doing things, because we can't just change the existing way something works, because as I said, that basically means that you break potentially all the programs out there that are actually depending on the var keyword working exactly the way it works. And the lesson you need to take away, the real lesson here, is that when you write software, you need to think about it from the perspective that changing something can be extremely difficult. In other words, don't make ad hoc decisions. Try your best to really think about what you're doing, and try the best, like to the greatest extent possible, to not add unnecessary things, to make unnecessary decisions, because you may not understand it today, but in just a little while, all of a sudden, all of these different decisions that you have made will start to come back and bite you, which means that going forward, it just becomes harder and harder and harder and harder and harder. The more code you have, the more shit you have to deal with. Have a great day.